In just 7 hours, a secret deal was set to wipe out tens of thousands of American jobs. A deal hidden deep within legal jargon, overlooked by those trusted to protect us. But in a quiet midnight room, J.D. Vance saw what no one else did. The clock was ticking. The signatures were ready. And one man's legal brilliance stood between a nation's workers and disaster. This is the story of a moment that could have changed everything, and the courage it took to stop it. As you listen, remember, what you're about to hear is a dramatized account, crafted to inspire reflection on real struggles and choices. The names are true, the emotions are real, but the events have been shaped for storytelling. Could you have spotted the danger? So take a breath and come with us into a night where one choice changed everything. The clock on the mantel read 12:03 a.m., its second hand ticking steadily, the only sound in the stillness. J.D. Vance sat alone at his kitchen table, a single lamp casting a warm pool of light over the mess of papers spread before him. The rest of the house lay in darkness, asleep, but J.D.'s mind refused to follow. Before him were pages of reports, steelworker layoffs, factory closures, union pleas that seemed more like cries in the dark. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes red from hours of reading, as if sheer determination could make the numbers stop bleeding. The night outside was bitter. Through the window the trees stood frozen, unmoving beneath a pale moon. The kind of night, J.D. thought, where even shadows seemed to hold their breath. Then, the ring. It wasn't the friendly chime of a late-night call from an old friend. This was sharp, insistent, a sound that didn't belong in the silence. J.D. froze, heart thudding once before he reached for the phone. "Vance here," he said, voice low but steady. On the other end, a voice he recognized, a senior aide from Capitol Hill. But tonight, that voice was stripped of its usual polish. It was quiet, as if afraid of who might overhear even through the phone lines. "Senator Vance, we need you in D.C. immediately. National security is at risk. That's all I can say over the phone. Please, sir." There was a beat of silence, heavy as the air before a storm. J.D. didn't ask for more. Something in the man's tone, the urgency laced with fear, told him this wasn't politics as usual. He hung up slowly, the weight of those words settling on him. National security at risk. For a moment he just sat there listening. The house seemed to listen with him. No creaks, no groans, just that eerie, perfect stillness of midnight. J.D. rose, pushing back the chair quietly, as if the house itself needed protecting from whatever waited beyond its walls. His coat hung by the door, the familiar heavy wool that had seen him through hard winters in Ohio. He slipped it on, his movements slow, deliberate. Each gesture felt meaningful, like the start of something he couldn't name. The air hit him the moment he stepped outside, sharp, clean, carrying the scent of cold metal and wood smoke. The street was empty, as if the world had emptied itself, leaving only J.D. in the night. Lights were on in exactly 2 houses down the block. Maybe other souls, awake with their own worries. Maybe not. He hesitated on the porch, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. What could be so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning? But deep down, J.D. knew. The kind of call that came at midnight wasn't one you ignored. It wasn't a drill. It wasn't theater. As he walked to his car, keys cold in his hand, 1,000 questions crowded his mind. Was this about the trade deal he'd heard whispers of? A breach? A threat to the homeland? J.D. felt the weight of every steelworker report he'd read that night pressing against him, as if the voices of those men and women were urging him forward. Engine turning over in the dark, J.D. glanced once more at his home. The porch light glowing faintly, the window where the lamp still burned. A quiet promise, "I'll come back with answers." And with that, he drove into the night, the road ahead empty, the unknown waiting beyond each bend. The highway had been empty, as if even the night itself had cleared a path for J.D.'s urgent journey. The hum of tires on the cold asphalt was the only sound in his world, mile after mile of dark horizon broken only by flickering highway lights. By the time he reached D.C., the first hint of dawn was still hours away. The city's heart was cloaked in shadows, The monuments he knew so well standing silent, as if waiting for the storm they could sense but not see. JD pulled into the secure lot beneath a government building he'd entered only a handful of times before, always for matters that weighed heavier than politics, the kind of place where smiles were rare and eyes watched everything. As he stepped out of the car, the chill of the concrete structure wrapped around him, colder than the air outside, colder even than the night. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed quietly over polished floors that reflected his steady stride. Men and women in suits and uniforms moved with hushed urgency, their faces pale, their expressions drawn tight. The usual Washington theater was absent. This was not the time for posturing. JD's boots echoed down the hallway as he was led through layers of security, each checkpoint more solemn than the last. Every so often he caught snippets of whispered conversations, phrases like, "They missed it," "Hours left," "We can't let it through." His mind raced to fill in the blanks, but the pieces refused to fit. And then, as a staffer pushed open the heavy door of the briefing room, JD froze, not because of the room itself, though its starkness was striking, a long table littered with folders and coffee cups, a digital clock on the far wall counting down from 6 hours. What stopped him was the person entering from the opposite door at that exact moment. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. For a breath, neither of them spoke. JD could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes, the momentary confusion quickly masked by practiced composure. She had not expected him here any more than he had expected her. The air between them felt charged, as if the room itself was caught off guard by their collision. AOC broke the silence first, her tone edged but low, respecting the gravity of the space. "Did they run out of experts?" JD didn't hesitate. The weariness of the night gave his voice a dry edge. "Funny, I was wondering the same about you." Their eyes met, two opposing forces, both summoned to the same battlefield, neither sure yet who the enemy was. There was no time for the usual sparring, but the weight of past debates, of divided causes, hung in the room like smoke. A staffer gestured toward the table, urgency cutting through the tension. "Please, we need to begin. There's no time to waste." JD moved toward the table, his gaze lingering for a moment on the clock. 6 hours, a countdown not just to some bureaucratic deadline, but to something larger, something neither of them yet understood. He felt the cold knot of responsibility tighten in his chest as he reached for the first folder. AOC took the seat opposite him, her brow furrowed, fingers already flipping through the stack of papers set before her. Outside, the city remained cloaked in silence. But inside this room, the storm had begun to gather. Whatever lines had divided them before, JD sensed they would soon be fighting on the same side, against a threat neither of them had yet seen clearly, but one that would demand everything they had. The soft click of the door closing behind them seemed to seal the room off from the rest of the world. The air inside was heavy, the kind of heavy that came not from lack of oxygen, but from the weight of what waited within. The briefing room was larger than JD expected, but its size only seemed to amplify the stillness. The lighting was dim, overhead fluorescence flickering as if even the electricity sensed the tension. Shadows clung to the corners, as though reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. Against the far wall, a digital clock glowed red, numbers ticking down with ruthless precision. 055837. 055836. The signing of a trade deal, JD had been told in hurried whispers, though no one had dared offer more. The steady march of seconds was a reminder that time, once lost, was gone forever. They were led to a long table scarred by years of urgent meetings, its surface now littered with thick folders, unopened, waiting like traps. A staffer with tired eyes and a voice almost too soft to hear gestured at the documents. "This is it. No summaries, just the text. We were told you'd understand." JD exchanged a glance with AOC, no longer the glare of rivals, but the look of two people realizing the size of the mountain before them. She gave a small, tight nod and reached for the first folder. JD followed suit, his fingers brushing the coarse paper, feeling as though he'd just laid hands on something far heavier than pages. He flipped it open. The text was dense, legalese layered upon legalese, clauses folded into subclauses, paragraphs stitched with references to other documents not included. It was a maze designed not for clarity, but for concealment. JD's stomach tightened as he scanned line after line, the sheer complexity like a wall rising in front of him. The room remained silent, but for the quiet rustle of paper and the steady, merciless countdown on the wall. Outside these walls, the nation slept, unaware that decisions made here, in this moment, could shape their futures. AOC broke the silence, her voice low, tinged with frustration. No summaries? Who sends lawmakers into battle without weapons? JD didn't answer at first. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the pattern, to find the thread that would unravel this knot. He could feel it, the wrongness hidden in these words. He didn't know where it was yet, but he could sense its presence, like a shadow in his periphery. He turned another page, eyes narrowing. A phrase caught his attention. Exceptions to domestic labor compliance. The words were dry, but the implications hit him like ice water. He reread it, heart sinking. The language was crafted to look benign, just another procedural note, but its placement, its subtle phrasing, hinted at something far more dangerous. JD sat back for the briefest of moments, the weight of realization pressing down. This wasn't just a trade deal with a few rough edges. There was something buried here, something meant to slide past unnoticed. And if it did, the cost wouldn't be measured in political points or headlines. It would be measured in livelihoods, in communities hollowed out, in futures stolen in the dark. The clock ticked on. 5:56:12, 5:56:11. JD leaned forward again, determination hardening his features. AOC, catching the shift in his expression, looked up. In that shared glance, words weren't needed. Both understood. They weren't just reading. They were racing the clock to stop a disaster no one else had seen coming. The pages beneath their hands felt heavier now, as if the weight of what lay hidden in the legal maze had begun to seep into the air itself. The dim light above flickered again, casting brief shadows that danced across the table, as if the room itself shared in their unease. The clock on the wall continued its relentless count, every tick like a hammer striking steel. 0:5:56:10, 0:5:56:9. AOC flipped through the documents, her brow furrowed, frustration etched into every line of her face. The words blurred together, a wall of legal terminology designed, she was sure, to overwhelm rather than inform. She shook her head, fingers tightening on the edge of the paper. "How do they expect us to catch anything in this mess?" she muttered, voice low but sharp, as if afraid to speak too loudly in the presence of something so dangerous. JD didn't look up. His eyes moved steadily across the text, page after page, his mind filtering the clutter, searching for patterns. Years of legal work had taught him that the most dangerous traps were never where one first looked. They were buried in the ordinary, hidden in the language that lulled the reader into lowering their guard. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the shadows deeper. The buzz of the lights seemed louder, but louder still was the clock, its ticking no longer background noise but the steady drumbeat of a threat growing nearer. JD could feel it, not in any single word, but in the rhythm of the document, the way certain phrases repeated, the places where clarity should have lived but didn't. AOC set one folder down with a quiet thump that echoed in the room's stillness. She rubbed her temples, glancing at JD with a mix of impatience and reluctant respect. "You're actually making sense of this?" she asked, more accusation than curiosity, as if the idea that anyone could was both hopeful and infuriating. JD's voice was quiet, focused, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile thread of concentration. "Not sense, not yet, but there's a pattern. There always is." He turned a page, his finger tracing a paragraph as his mind worked to decode it. Outside the thick walls of the building, the world remained unaware, the city silent in its slumber, streetlights casting pools of gold on empty streets. Inside, that silence felt like a weight pressing down, as if the night itself waited to see what they would find. AOC sighed, picked up another stack of pages, and forced herself to read. JD's calm focus, infuriating though it was, reminded her why they were here. Not for speeches, not for cameras, but because something had gone terribly wrong and no one else had seen it. The clock ticked on, louder with each passing second. 5:55:22, 5:55:21. JD's pulse matched its rhythm now, but his mind was clearer than it had been all night. He felt the threads beginning to connect, the pieces of the trap starting to reveal their shape. Somewhere in these pages was the key. He was certain of it, and he would find it. Because if they failed, it wouldn't be just words on paper that would fall apart. It would be families, towns, futures. The storm outside might not have broken yet, but inside this room, JD could feel the first winds begin to rise. And still, the clock ticked down. The pages whispered beneath JD's fingertips, the weight of each one adding to the invisible pressure that thickened the air. The clock continued its merciless countdown, each red digit a reminder of how little time they had left. 05:55:20, 05:55:19. The steady tick no longer felt like sound but like a heartbeat, shared by everyone in the room, whether they acknowledged it or not. JD's eyes scanned line after line, his focus unbroken, his mind weaving connections faster now, seeing patterns where only moments ago there had been noise. And then, his hand froze, buried in the middle of a dense paragraph, tucked between harmless-sounding provisions on compliance review and supply chain reporting, was a phrase that sent a chill down his spine. His finger hovered above it, tracing the words as if to anchor them in place. Exceptions to domestic labor compliance requirements in instances of foreign direct investment or multinational corporate structure realignment. To most, it would look like bureaucratic language, just another layer of complexity in a document full of them. But to JD, it was a crack in the foundation, one wide enough for disaster to slip through. His pulse quickened, but his voice when he spoke was steady, low, as if not to disturb the fragile air around them. "Listen to this," he said quietly, his tone enough to draw AOC's gaze, her expression shifting from exhaustion to alertness. JD read the line aloud, every syllable deliberate, the meaning sinking into the room like cold water. The effect was immediate. The room seemed to still, the quiet hum of electronics and ticking clock suddenly deafening in their contrast to the silence that followed his words. AOC leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The fight that had lived in her all night now sharpened by something closer to fear. "That can't be intentional, can it?" she asked, the words more to herself than to him, as if trying to reason with the unease that crept into her voice. JD didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the page, reading and rereading, tracing how the loophole threaded through other sections, how it cleverly avoided clear accountability. He could see it now. The path that clause opened for companies to sidestep U.S. labor protections, to ship jobs overseas under the cover of legal fog. He could see the towns that would suffer, the families who'd wake to find their futures sold off in the night. "It doesn't matter if it's intentional," JD said at last, his voice low but resolute. "If it's signed, it's law. And that line right there, it's a doorway." AOC sat back, the weight of his words settling on her. The tension that had once crackled between them as rivals now bound them together, two sides of the same coin, facing a common threat they could no longer ignore. The clock ticked on. 5:53:45, 5:53:44. JD closed the folder slowly, as if the document might bite if handled too fast. His mind raced ahead. How to raise the alarm, how to stop what had been set in motion. He glanced at AOC, saw the determination harden in her eyes, and felt it mirror his own. Outside, the city remained asleep, but inside this room, the storm had found its center. And as the seconds fell away, so too did any illusion that this was just another night in Washington. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier, as if the discovery of that one hidden clause had drawn the walls closer. The clock ticked on, an unrelenting reminder. 5:53:43, 5:53:42. JD felt the weight of those seconds press against his chest, but even heavier was the decision that now loomed before them. His gaze met AOC's across the table, and in that moment, the question neither had spoken out loud hovered between them. What now? AOC broke the silence first, her voice low but sharp, like the crack of ice beneath a boot. We can't let this happen. We have to alert the leadership, the press, someone. JD shook his head slowly, eyes steady on hers. We can't go public. Not yet. We don't have enough. They'll drown it in denials and technicalities before morning. His tone was measured, but beneath it lived the same urgency she felt. The tension between them flared. Two visions of the world, two instincts honed in different arenas now colliding under the same roof. AOC leaned forward, her frustration returning like a spark catching dry grass. So we just sit here? Hope someone else stops it? No, JD said, his voice firmer, cutting through the rising heat. But we need a strategy. We need to understand the full scope before we make a move. If we don't, we'll fail. And failure means this loophole swallows everything. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. AOC opened her mouth, ready to argue, but then paused. She studied him, really studied him, for the first time that night. His eyes weren't on her, but on the pages before him, tracing lines, connecting dots, seeing the fight ahead not as a soundbite or a headline, but as a puzzle that demanded solving. And in that instant, her frustration shifted, just slightly. She saw past the party label, past the public persona. She saw a man not playing a game, but shouldering a burden. A man determined to find the fault line before it shattered lives. JD glanced up, sensing the change in her gaze. And for his part, he saw in her not the fiery opponent he'd sparred with on television, but a woman who cared deeply, ferociously, about the people this deal would crush. Her drive wasn't theater. It was real. The clock continued its countdown. 5:52, 10, 5:52, 9. The seconds between them stretched, the room suspended in that fragile space where adversaries could become allies or fall apart entirely. AOC exhaled slowly, the fire in her tempered now by focus. Okay, what's your plan? JD allowed himself the briefest nod. We read every page, we find every thread, and when we move with precision. She picked up the next folder without another word, and JD did the same. The tension hadn't vanished. It crackled still, but now it was the tension of two minds straining toward the same goal, not against each other. Outside, the night deepened. The city remained blind to the battle waged in that quiet room. But inside, the lines that had divided them began, slowly, to blur. Not erased, but redrawn by necessity, by duty, by the recognition that in this moment they stood together, whether they liked it or not. And still the clock ticked down. The air in the room had shifted. What moments earlier had been charged with the crackling tension of two minds uniting now felt heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The faint sound of footsteps in the corridor outside grew louder, and the door creaked open just enough for a senior official, face pale, voice tight, to step inside. His eyes darted from JD to AOC and back again, as if searching for some sign they'd abandoned this dangerous pursuit. You have to let this go, the man said, his words tumbling out faster than his breath could keep up. It's too late. This deal is in motion. Stopping it now, it'll collapse everything. The fallout would be catastrophic. You can't stop it, not tonight. JD remained seated for a moment, staring at the man as if weighing whether to respond. The clock loomed behind him, its red digits relentless. 5:51:30, 5:51:29. JD's jaw clenched as he rose slowly to his feet, his shadow stretching across the table. The steady, controlled calm in his voice carried more force than any shout could have. I will not let this slide, he said, his eyes locked on the officials. Not again. The words were simple, but they landed like a blow. They carried with them the weight of memory, of towns hollowed out, of families left behind, of promises broken under the guise of progress. The official hesitated, seemed about to argue, then thought better of it. Without another word, he stepped back into the hall, closing the door as if trying to shut out what had just passed between them. The silence that followed felt absolute, but it lasted only a beat before AOC broke it, her voice low, firm. Then let's work. JD nodded, already reaching for a notepad. AOC pulled her laptop closer, her fingers hovering above the keys, eyes sharp with purpose. Whatever lines had divided them were forgotten now, burned away by the urgency of the task before them. The hum of electronics filled the room, the laptop's keys clacking, the soft scrape of JD's pen across paper, as they began to map out their emergency legal challenge. JD's mind raced, pulling from years of experience, recalling every procedural lever, every precedent that might be used to halt the deal's momentum. "We argue breach of congressional oversight," JD said, not looking up. "Failure of transparency. There's enough here to justify an emergency injunction." AOC's voice followed his, building on his thought without hesitation. "We frame it as national interest, jobs, security, the integrity of the process. We show this isn't obstruction, it's protection." Their words overlapped at times, but the rhythm between them built, no longer adversarial, but symphonic in its urgency. They were no longer two sides of a political divide. In that room, in that moment, they were the front line. The clock ticked on, 5:49:10, 5:49:9. The seconds fell away, but neither JD nor AOC noticed. Their focus was absolute, their determination unshaken. Outside, the city remained silent, unaware of the battle raging in this small room, where two voices worked as one to defy the tide. And as the night deepened, so did their resolve. They would not let this happen, not tonight, not on their watch. The room felt different now. The initial panic had given way to purpose, the kind that sharpens the senses and quickens the mind. The clock on the wall continued its steady march toward dawn. 5:49 a.m., 5:48 a.m. But where its ticking had once been oppressive, now it was a drumbeat, pushing them forward. JD's notepad was already filling with scrawled notes and arrows, connections forming in hurried script. The legal threads were there, thin, fraying, but there, and he intended to weave them into something strong enough to hold back disaster. "We freeze it," JD said, his voice steady, low, as he mapped the strategy aloud. His pen underlined a point on the page, then moved on. "Breach of congressional oversight. This deal's structure, this clause, they're violating transparency requirements. We argue that the administration overstepped. We demand an injunction pending full congressional review." AOC listened, leaning in, her focus as fierce as his. The fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. It had simply been redirected, refined. She nodded once, absorbing his reasoning, seeing how the pieces fit together. "It's a strong angle," she said, "but it can't just be technical. We need to appeal not just to law, but to conscience. This isn't paperwork. This is people. We have to frame it so no one can pretend they don't see the human cost." JD paused, looking up at her, and for a heartbeat the weight of her words settled between them. She was right. The law could open the door, but it would be moral force that pushed it wide enough for others to follow. He drew a line beneath his notes, writing the word integrity in capital letters. "Then we present both, the legal breach and the moral failure. We show how this deal was designed to hide its damage, how it betrays the trust of the people it's supposed to serve." Outside, the night deepened, the city's skyline etched in silent shadows, unaware of the storm gathering in this small room. Inside, the hum of the laptop, the scratch of JD's pen, the soft rhythm of thought given form, these were the sounds of the fight beginning in earnest. AOC began drafting language for their brief, her words chosen with precision, each sentence designed to cut through the fog of legal jargon and hit where it mattered. JD continued shaping the procedural path, citing statutes, recalling cases, his mind a flurry of connections drawn from years of work that had led him here, to this moment. The clock pressed on. 5:47:15, 5:47:14. JD glanced at it, then back at his notes. "We'll need allies to file this. We can't do it alone. We target those who still believe in oversight, who can't ignore the facts once they see them." AOC didn't hesitate. "I'll make the calls. You finish this." There was no need for further debate. They were past that now. What mattered was the plan, the action, the race against time. Together they worked, their differences no longer barriers but strengths, each sharpening the other's resolve. And as the seconds slipped away, the first shape of hope began to form on the page. The draft of the emergency legal brief lay on the table between them, ink still drying on JD's final notes, the glow of AOC's laptop screen reflecting in her determined gaze. Outside the room's thick windows, the city's first hints of dawn remained hidden, the night still holding its breath. The clock on the wall kept its relentless pace. 5:47:13, 5:47:12. There was no time for second guessing. JD gathered the papers, the weight of them far greater than the few ounces they actually carried. Beside him, AOC closed her laptop, straightened, and nodded once. No more words needed. They left the room together, stepping into the sterile brightness of the corridor beyond, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor as they made their way toward the offices of their most trusted congressional allies. Each step felt like pushing against a rising tide. The silence of the building, the dimmed lights, the emptiness of halls that by day would be filled with voices and purpose. It all added to the sense that they were walking deeper into something vast and dangerous. They delivered the brief with urgency, not ceremony, placing it in the hands of those few colleagues they believed would act not out of politics, but out of duty. JD spoke quickly, outlining the breach, the risks, the path to intervention. AOC added the moral weight, the human cost, her words sharp and clear. There was no time for persuasion, only truth laid bare, and hope that it would be enough. But as quickly as they had moved, the pushback came faster still. It began with calls, JD's phone vibrating in his coat pocket, AOC's buzzing in her hand. Names flashed on the screens, names that carried weight, voices that could command rooms with a word. JD answered the first, his tone respectful but firm. The voice on the other end wasted no time on pleasantries. You need to back off this, Vance. You don't understand what's at stake. You derail this deal now, you'll bring down more than just an agreement. This is bigger than your crusade. JD listened, jaw tightening, the words familiar. He'd heard variations of them before, always when something rotten needed protecting. He let the caller finish, then spoke, calm and unyielding. No, this isn't bigger than the people it will hurt, and I won't stand down. He ended the call before the man could reply. AOC glanced at him, saw the steel in his expression, and felt it strengthen her own resolve. Her phone rang again. Another name, another warning disguised as advice. She let it ring. There was no point in answering what she wouldn't entertain. They stood together in the quiet of that hallway, the weight of the fight settling around them like the first gusts of a coming storm. They knew what was next, the flood of pressure, the whispered threats, the promises of consequence. But neither flinched. The clock ticked on. 5:45 a.m. 5:44 a.m. The first battle had begun, not with shouts or spectacle, but with the quiet defiance of two people who refused to look away, who braced themselves against the tide and chose to stand. The corridor where JD and AOC had stood moments earlier now felt colder, the quiet around them no longer a shield, but a void where danger could hide. They'd braced for pushback, expected pressure, but what came next felt different, sharper, as if the tide had shifted faster than they'd thought possible. The clock's relentless march echoed louder. 5:44:58, 5:44:57. They had barely made it back to their makeshift war room when the first signs appeared. AOC's phone lit up. News alerts, headlines that hadn't existed 10 minutes ago. JD glanced at the screen, the sinking feeling in his gut tightening as he read the words. Sources, Vance, Ocasio-Cortez, plotting to derail historic trade deal. Insiders claim secret effort to block economic growth. Someone had leaked their plan. The air in the room felt thinner, as if the walls had drawn in another inch. JD's mind raced, cataloging who had seen the brief, who had been in those corridors, who might have had something to gain by turning their fight into ammunition for the deal's backers. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The name on the screen wasn't one he trusted, but it wasn't one he could ignore either. He answered, the weight of inevitability already in his voice. The voice on the other end was calm, almost polite, but beneath the civility lay steel. "You've made your point, JD. Now it's time to stand down. You're walking into something bigger than you understand. This isn't just politics anymore. This is your career, and it's about to end if you keep pushing." JD said nothing at first. He could feel AOC's eyes on him, waiting, listening. The clock ticked on. 5:43:10, 5:43:9. The pause stretched, the silence on the line heavier than any threat. Then JD spoke, his voice steady, the calm of someone who had already made peace with what had to come. "If this is bigger than protecting American jobs, than keeping promises, than doing what's right, then I guess I don't want that career." He ended the call without waiting for a reply, his thumb lingering for a second on the screen, as if to seal the decision. AOC crossed her arms, a flicker of grim admiration passing through her features. "They're scared," she said quietly. "Scared enough to try to break us before we can break this deal." JD nodded once, the fire in his eyes tempered by resolve. "Then we're getting close." The tension in the room grew heavier, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the knowledge that they'd stepped beyond the point of no return. The leak had exposed them, made them targets, but it had also made clear that their challenge mattered, that the ground beneath this deal was shakier than its supporters wanted the world to know. The clock kept counting down. 5:41:45, 5:41:44. Outside, the first pale light of dawn began to creep into the edges of the sky, unseen by those in the room, but signaling that the night's battle was far from over. And inside, JD and AOC stood shoulder to shoulder, bracing for the storm that had truly begun. The echoes of that chilling phone call still hung in the air as JD lowered the device, his hands steady despite the storm it had unleashed. The room felt charged, as if the very walls had absorbed the threat and now hummed with its energy. AOC stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of tension and quiet expectation. The clock pressed on. 5:41:43, 5:41:42. Each second a drumbeat driving them closer to the edge. JD drew in a slow breath, the kind that clears not just the lungs, but the mind. He turned, facing the small group of aides and legal staff who had gathered in the room, faces pale from the weight of what they knew, but eyes searching his for direction. The leak had rattled them. The pressure was mounting, but JD could not, would not let this moment fracture their resolve. "We don't stand for what's easy," he began, his voice low, steady, but carrying a force that filled the room. "We stand for what's right, and what's right isn't always popular or safe or simple. But that's the fight we're in, and that's the one we're going to win tonight." The words landed like anchors in the rising storm. JD saw the shift in their expressions, the flicker of fear replaced by focus, the uncertainty edged out by purpose. The moment for doubt had passed. Now it was time to act. He stepped to the table, pulling the brief back toward him, flipping through the pages with a swift precision. His mind raced through contingencies, scenarios, ways the opposition might try to outmaneuver them now that the plan was exposed. "They'll come at this procedurally," JD said, more to himself at first, then to the room as the plan took shape in his mind. "They'll argue timeliness, jurisdiction, standing, anything to bury us before we're heard. So we tighten the brief, we cite emergency precedent, we demonstrate irreparable harm, and we file directly where we have the best chance to force a pause." AOC moved beside him, reading over his shoulder, her voice measured but strong. "And the messaging stays clear. This is about protecting people, not playing politics. We show them what's at stake, what they'll have to answer for if they look the other way." JD nodded, the plan crystallizing with each word. He made quick notes in the margins, adjusted phrasing, sharpened arguments. Each stroke of the pen a barrier against the flood he knew was coming. The room grew quieter, the tension no less intense, but now focused, purposeful. Outside, the first pale streaks of dawn began to creep into the night's darkness. Though the room's occupants remained oblivious, their world reduced to paper, ink, and the ticking clock. 05:39:15. 05:39:14. JD straightened, The revised plan laid out before him, his voice steady as he looked to the team. We don't flinch. We don't fold. They can threaten all they want, but we move forward, because this is what it means to serve. The aides nodded one by one, their resolve mirrored in AOC's determined gaze. Together they prepared for what came next, not with bravado, but with the quiet, unshakable courage of those who choose to do what's right, no matter the cost. And still, the clock ticked down, the storm gathering its full force beyond the walls of that room. The room, though steadied by JD's words, still trembled with undercurrents of doubt. Faces that moments ago had found resolve began to exchange uneasy glances as the gravity of what they were about to challenge settled over them. One aide, voice hesitant but edged with fear, spoke what the group had been too cautious to say aloud. Senator Vance's plan is bold, but what if it backfires? What if it brings more harm than good? Maybe we should step back before this goes too far. The silence that followed was sharp, cutting through the hum of the lights in the ticking clock. 05:39:12. 05:39:11. The words hung there, fragile, like a thread threatening to snap. JD stood still, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking briefly toward AOC, not in plea but in recognition that this was a moment where her voice would matter more than his. AOC didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, the tension in her shoulders visible, but her voice unwavering. We didn't come here for comfort, she said, her tone low but fierce, each word measured, slicing through the fog of uncertainty. We came here for truth. We came here to do what's right when no one else would. If you think backing down now will make the threat disappear, you're lying to yourselves. This isn't about easy. It never was. The aides fell quiet, the weight of her words pulling them back from the brink. JD watched her, saw not the opponent he'd so often debated across microphones and screens, but the ally he'd hoped for in this fight. A voice that could carry the charge they needed, one that refused to bend to fear. AOC turned to him, and for the first time that night, there was something in her gaze beyond determination, a shared understanding, the unspoken bond of two people who had seen the same storm and chosen to face it, not run. JD allowed himself the briefest nod, not of victory, but of recognition. Thank you, he said quietly, knowing the fight ahead would demand both their strengths. She shook her head. This isn't about me. It's about all of us, and what we choose right now. Together they moved back to the table, shoulders squared, the doubts of moments ago left behind. The aides followed, no longer questioning, their eyes set on the path JD and AOC had drawn. JD pointed to the revised brief, explaining the adjustments, the safeguards, the precise language that would withstand the procedural traps he knew were coming. AOC added the moral framing, shaping the message that would resonate beyond the legal walls, into the hearts of those who would soon have to choose whether to act or stand aside. Their voices wove together, not in harmony of thought, but in unity of purpose. The clock ticked on. 5:37:30, 5:37:29. Outside, the city began to stir, unaware of the storm about to break. Inside, the storm's center had shifted, from doubt to resolve, from fear to courage. Whatever came next, JD and AOC would face it together, not as rivals, but as defenders of a promise greater than any party line. The room had settled into a focused hum, the sound of keys clacking, pens scratching, minds working in tandem toward a single, fragile hope. But JD felt the weight pressing harder now, heavier than before. The plan was in motion, the team aligned. But inside, a storm of doubt began to stir. Without a word, he stepped away from the table, his exit so quiet it drew no attention. He moved down the hall and out through a side door, leaving behind the fluorescent glow for the cold embrace of the night. Outside, the city lay cloaked in stillness. The stars were hidden, the sky thick with low clouds that swallowed the moon and left only darkness above. The streetlights cast long, pale beams on empty sidewalks, and the hum of distant traffic was little more than a memory beneath the weight of the hour. JD drew in a breath, the cold air biting at his lungs, grounding him in the moment. But the quiet offered no peace, only space for the doubts he'd kept at bay to rise. He stood alone, the chill sinking through his coat, and for a long moment let his mind drift back to another night, another silence, one that had shaped him in ways no debate or vote ever could. He saw again the small house where he'd grown up, the porch light flickering as if trying to hold off the darkness that had settled over them. Inside, the rooms had felt vast, hollow, stripped of the life that had once filled them. His father's layoff had come without warning, without ceremony, just a folded letter, a final paycheck, and a silence that followed like a shadow. JD remembered the sound of that silence most. No laughter, no music, no clatter of dishes, just the oppressive quiet of loss. He could see his father at the kitchen table, shoulders slumped, staring at nothing as the weight of what had been taken from him settled in. JD had been just a boy, but even then he'd understood what that silence meant, that something vital had been stolen, not just from his father, but from all of them. Now standing alone on this cold street, that memory felt as close as the night air, and with it came the fear that he wasn't enough, that no brief, no argument, no strategy would be enough to stop what was coming. The stakes were larger now, the stage broader, but the threat felt the same. JD's breath clouded before him, the vapor vanishing into the dark. He stared out over the city, the weight of the coming dawn pressing against his chest, and wondered just for a moment if the storm he and AOC were fighting could truly be turned aside. But then beneath the doubt he felt it, the ember that memory always left behind. Not just the pain, but the promise that he would never let that silence claim another family if he could help it. He stood straighter, the cold forgotten, and turned back toward the building where the fight waited. The clock inside kept ticking down, but JD's resolve had steadied. There was work to finish. JD stood there for what felt like a long while, the cold air settling into his bones, though he barely noticed. The city's silence stretched around him, broken only by the faint hum of streetlights and the distant whisper of a siren, too far away to mean anything here. He heard the door open behind him, the soft creak of hinges that had seen decades of nights like this one, nights where decisions weighed heavier than words. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. AOC stepped out beside him, saying nothing at first. The tension that often lived between them had no place here, not in this moment. They stood in the quiet together, two figures framed by the glow of the building's security lights, their breath rising in faint clouds that disappeared into the dark. For a time, neither spoke. The city, the hour, the stakes, they all demanded a kind of reverence. When JD finally found his voice, it came low, as if sharing a truth meant only for the night to hear. "I promised myself," he said slowly, the words shaped by memory, by hurt, by a vow that had never left him, that no other kid would watch their dad fall apart like I did. Not if I could stop it. AOC turned to him, the sharp edges of debate and policy gone from her gaze. What remained was simple, human understanding. "Then let's make sure of it," she said quietly. No rhetoric, no strategy, just the promise of shared purpose. JD glanced at her, and in the pale light he saw not the rival he'd faced across committee rooms or news broadcasts, but someone who carried her own weight of promises, of nights spent staring down impossible choices. For the first time, the lines between them blurred fully, not erased, but irrelevant. A breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of cold stone and distant rain. JD drew in a breath, felt the tension in his shoulders ease just enough for him to straighten, to find the center he needed for what lay ahead. "No more speeches tonight," he said, a faint trace of dry humor softening the edge of his fatigue. "No politics, just the work." AOC nodded, her lips curling in the ghost of a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but in it was resolve, and that was enough. "Just the work," she echoed. Together they turned back toward the building, the brief moment of quiet understanding giving way to the urgency that still waited inside. The storm hadn't passed, it had only paused, long enough for them to remember why they fought and who they fought for. The clock inside continued its steady countdown, 5:35:12, 5:35:11. But as JD and AOC stepped through the door and into the light once more, the weight of those seconds felt different, less like a threat and more like a challenge they would face, side by side. The quiet understanding JD and AOC had shared outside dissolved the moment they stepped back into the building's fluorescent-lit corridors. The air inside felt different now, charged not just with the urgency of their work, but with the storm that had finally broken over them. The first sign came in the form of phones vibrating on the table, screens lighting up with alerts, calls, and messages. JD glanced down, his gut tightening at the headlines that flashed across the notifications. Vance and Ocasio-Cortez accused of sabotaging historic trade deal. Obstructionists derail economic progress in final hours. Secret plot by fringe lawmakers threatens U.S. interests. The words came sharp and fast, as relentless as the ticking clock, 5:35:10, 5:35:9. The media storm had arrived, and with it the full weight of the opposition's fury. AOC's phone buzzed again and again, messages piling up from staffers, colleagues, journalists eager for a soundbite, or more likely, a scapegoat. JD's rang too, names flashing on the screen. Some he'd once counted as allies, now demanding explanations, denials, surrender. The flood of criticism had been unleashed, the narrative twisted before they had had a chance to speak their truth. For a moment the room felt smaller, as if the walls had crept closer, the storm outside pressing in on all sides. JD saw one aide pale as they scrolled through a feed of breaking news, their confidence shaken, their fingers trembling just slightly. But JD didn't waver. He glanced at AOC, found her watching him, her expression set, the fire in her eyes undimmed. No words passed between them in that instant. None were needed. They had known this was coming. They had braced for it. "We hold," JD said quietly, his voice carrying across the room, steady as stone. AOC nodded, adding, "Let them talk. Let them try to drown this out. We know what's at stake. We keep going." Their calm became an anchor in the rising tide, drawing the eyes of the staff, steadying hands that had begun to shake. Together, JD and AOC turned back to their work, tuning out the noise beyond these walls. The storm might rage louder with every passing minute, but inside this room, the focus remained unbroken. JD refined the legal strategy further, anticipating new procedural attacks the opposition would try as the media frenzy bought them cover. AOC sharpened the language of their message, framing the truth so that when the moment came to speak, it would cut through the noise like a blade. Outside, dawn began to edge closer, though the sky remained dark, the city's heartbeat masked beneath the roar of headlines and speculation. Inside, the seconds slipped away. 5:33 a.m., 5:32 a.m., but JD and AOC stood their ground, two voices against the storm, unshaken, unwilling to yield. And as the criticism mounted, as the storm's fury grew, they knew one thing above all: the louder the opposition screamed, the closer they must be to striking the heart of the danger they had sworn to stop. The storm outside the building was no longer just in headlines or whispered warnings. It had followed JD and AOC through secured corridors, up polished staircases, and into the heart of the Capitol itself. The chamber where key lawmakers now waited felt both vast and suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down from the gilded ceilings to the cold marble beneath their feet. The hum of conversation filled the space, urgent and sharp, as though the room itself buzzed with the electricity of the coming clash. JD and AOC stepped forward together, side by side, carrying their brief, their arguments, and the unshaken resolve that had seen them through the long night. Around them, faces turned, some curious, some skeptical, many hostile. Allies were few in this room. The opposition had been working while they worked, framing them as obstructionists, as threats to progress, as the reason the clock kept ticking without resolution. But neither JD nor AOC flinched. They had come to speak truth no matter the cost. A senior lawmaker leaned forward, eyes narrowed, voice clipped. "We've all heard the media frenzy. What we need now is clarity. What exactly are you trying to achieve by delaying this deal?" JD met the man's gaze, unblinking, his voice measured but firm. "We're not trying to delay for delay's sake. We're trying to stop a mistake before it's signed into law. A mistake that will cost this country more than it can afford to lose." Another voice cut in, sharper, angrier. "This is reckless. You're standing in the way of economic growth, of stability, Do you want to be responsible for tanking this deal and everything that comes with it? AOC stepped in then, her tone clear, unwavering. What's reckless is signing a deal that sells out American workers because no one took the time to read the fine print. What's reckless is pretending the damage won't come until it's too late to stop. The room stirred, murmurs rising like wind through dry leaves. JD let them speak. Let the tide of accusations roll for a moment before he raised his hand slightly, a quiet request for space. The room calmed, if only by degrees, and he began. With steady precision, JD laid out the legal flaws, the breach of congressional oversight, the procedural gaps, the hidden clause that would gut labor protections. He spoke not in sound bites but in facts, building the case piece by piece, knowing that clarity was their best weapon against the storm of rhetoric. And when another opponent tried to cut in with warnings of economic catastrophe, JD's voice rose just enough to hold the floor. We protect America by thinking, he said, each word deliberate, not rushing. We protect America by seeing what's coming, not pretending it won't. A hush settled for a heartbeat, the truth of that simple statement cutting through the noise. The opposition pressed on, of course, but the first cracks in their wall had begun to show. JD and AOC stood firm, the storm still howling around them, but their foundation steady. Outside, the first light of day began to touch the city's edges, the dawn of a new fight just beginning. Inside, the battle raged on, but JD and AOC had made their stand. The dawn crept toward the city, its first faint glow brushing against the cold marble and the stone of the Capitol. But inside the chamber, time felt suspended, stretched thin between the urgency of the moment and the weight of what was at stake. The hum of conversation had given way to something sharper, a mix of tension, impatience, and barely restrained anger from those who had expected this to be over hours ago. The signing ceremony was minutes away, the pens polished, the papers prepared, the photographers standing by in hushed anticipation. JD and AOC stood at the heart of it all, facing a room full of power and expectation, refusing to yield. The final plea had been made, the legal brief delivered not as a weapon of delay, but as a lifeline thrown across the chasm that threatened the future they had sworn to protect. JD's words from moments before still hung in the air, his final argument both precise and pointed. The deal could not, in good faith, proceed without addressing the breach of congressional oversight. AOC's voice had carried the human weight of that argument, reminding the room, with steady clarity, that real lives, not just numbers on a balance sheet, hung in the balance. A murmur rippled through the chamber as a senior procedural officer stepped forward, the legal brief in hand, its pages marked and annotated, already the subject of hurried review. The official's face bore the strain of the night, the lines of fatigue etched deep, but when he spoke, his voice was clear. There is merit to the objection, he announced, and in that instant, the room fell utterly silent. Under procedural rule, we are obligated to halt finalization of the agreement until the objection is reviewed in full by the appropriate committees. The signing is postponed pending that review. For a breathless moment, no one moved. The tension that had built like a rising tide through the long night now seemed frozen in place, as if the entire room were waiting for reality to catch up with what had just been said. JD felt the weight of it, the enormity of the pause they had forced, and allowed himself a slow breath, the kind that tasted of both relief and the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a longer fight. AOC met his gaze across the space between them, and in her expression he saw the same mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. There were no cheers, no applause. This was not that kind of victory. It was the kind measured not in noise, but in the silent acknowledgement of a disaster delayed, of a chance reclaimed. Outside, the light of dawn grew stronger, casting long shafts through the high windows, illuminating the chamber in soft gold. Inside, the storm had not passed, but it had for now been held at bay. The murmurs returned, some of frustration, some of grudging respect, some of calculation as those who had pushed the deal began to consider their next moves. But JD and AOC stood steady, their presence a reminder that even at the 11th hour, truth could still find its place. The clock on the wall, which had been a relentless drumbeat through the night, seemed at last to slow, its numbers no longer a threat but a measure of time earned. And as the city woke to a new day, the standoff at dawn had given the nation a second chance. The chamber emptied slowly, power brokers and lawmakers filing out with stiff shoulders and tight expressions, some offering curt nods, others refusing even that small courtesy. The postponement of the deal had rippled through the Capitol like a shockwave, and as the room cleared, the true cost of the night's fight began to reveal itself. JD remained where he stood for a long moment, feeling the weight in his bones, not just fatigue from the sleepless night, but the heaviness of the enemies he and AOC had just made. Whispers trailed in the wake of those leaving, promises of retribution cloaked as concern, warnings disguised as advice. There were no illusions left. JD knew what came next. The storm they had held back from the nation's workers would now turn its fury on them. AOC joined him at the edge of the chamber, her gaze following the last of the departing lawmakers. Her jaw was set, her shoulders squared, but he could see in her eyes that she too understood what the night had cost. Powerful interests did not forgive easily, and those they had forced to pause would spend the coming days sharpening their knives. "They'll come after us now," she said, her voice quiet but certain. JD nodded, watching as the first true light of day spilled through the high windows, bathing the chamber in gold that felt almost too pure for the bruised world it illuminated. "Let them," he replied, his voice as steady as it had been in the heat of the argument. "We didn't come here to be safe. We came here to do what's right." Together they left the chamber, their steps slow, heavy not with regret, but with the knowledge of the battles that lay ahead. The hallways of the Capitol felt colder now, as if the building itself had withdrawn from them, its silent walls bearing witness to their defiance. Staffers watched them pass, some with respect, some with calculation, some with open disapproval. Outside, the city had fully awakened, the streets beginning to hum with the life of a new day. JD stepped out into the morning air, the chill of dawn brushing his face, sharp and clean. He paused at the top of the steps, drawing in a breath that tasted of stone, cold metal, and possibility. The sky above was streaked with the soft fire of sunrise, clouds tinged pink and gold, as if the night's long fight had left its mark on the world itself. AOC stood beside him for a moment longer, then with a nod, turned and walked toward the day's next fight. Her figure soon lost in the swirl of staff and press. JD remained, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the storm inside him finally quiet. "This is what justice looks like," he murmured to no one, to the city, to himself. Not the roar of victory, not the cheers of crowds, but this, the quiet peace of having stood when it mattered, of having chosen the hard path because it was the right one. And as the sun climbed higher, JD turned from the dawn and walked down the steps, ready to face the price of that choice, whatever it might be. The first waves of backlash came fast, headlines filled with accusations, commentators framing JD and AOC as reckless obstructionists, and pundits warning of economic catastrophe. But as the dawn gave way to morning and morning to afternoon, something remarkable began to happen. Across the country, beyond the noise of Washington's corridors, people started to listen, not to the sound bites, but to the substance. The leaked clause JD and AOC had fought to expose made its way onto radio shows, newspaper columns, and social media threads. The human cost hidden within the trade deal's fine print became the focus, not the drama of the night before. By midday, the narrative had begun to shift. The same news outlets that had painted them as saboteurs started airing footage of JD's calm dismantling of rushed arguments, of AOC's fierce defense of working families. Editorials appeared praising their courage, not for stopping a deal, but for refusing to let haste become harm. In towns JD knew well, steel towns, farming communities, places where the promise of fair work had long been fragile, letters to editors, local talk shows, and community forums filled with voices of gratitude. "They saw us," one caller said on a morning radio show in Ohio. "For once, someone in D.C. didn't just rubber stamp the deal. They stood up for the people who'd get left behind." What surprised Washington most was not just the public's support, but its breadth. From conservative heartlands to liberal urban centers, JD and AOC became, almost overnight, unexpected symbols of something rare, Bipartisan integrity. They hadn't agreed on every word, hadn't needed to. But together they had shown that the fight for fairness could bridge divides that once seemed unmovable. Inside the Capitol, the mood was changing too. While some power brokers sharpened their knives, others paused, recalculating, realizing that opposing JD and AOC outright now risked alienating a public hungry for authenticity. Their stand had done more than delay a deal. It had reopened a conversation about accountability, about the cost of compromise when it comes at the expense of the people. Lawmakers are meant to serve. JD watched the shift quietly, knowing the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't dared let himself feel in the depths of the night. Hope. Far from the marble halls of the Capitol, in a small town where factory smokestacks lined the horizon and the hum of machines was part of daily life, a classroom fell quiet as the teacher dimmed the lights. The screen at the front flickered to life, casting a soft glow over the rows of students. These were the children of steel workers, farmers, shop owners, the kids who would one day inherit the consequences of decisions made in distant rooms they had never seen. The teacher, a man who'd grown up in this same town, cleared his throat and spoke with quiet purpose. I want you to see something, not just because it's history, but because it's a reminder of what courage looks like when it matters most. He pressed play. The video was simple. No flashy graphics, no dramatic music, just JD Vance standing before the lawmakers, his voice calm, measured, unshaken despite the storm around him. We protect America by thinking, not rushing. We protect America by seeing what's coming, not pretending it won't. Nations are saved not by noise, but by those who care enough to act. The classroom remained still. The usual rustle of papers, the quiet tapping of pencils, all forgotten as the words filled the room. The students watched not just the man, but the meaning behind his stance. Some recognized him from news clips their parents had watched the night before. Others saw him now for the first time, but all of them felt the weight of what he'd done. As the clip ended, the teacher stood silent for a beat, letting the message settle. Then he looked out at the rows of young faces. "What do you think that means?" he asked softly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, near the back, a boy barely old enough to understand the depth of what he'd just seen leaned forward, his voice a whisper, but clear in the quiet room. "Could I do that someday?" The teacher smiled, not the easy kind that came with simple answers, but one filled with hope and the gravity of the question. "You could," he said. "Every one of you could, because courage doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who care enough to use it." Outside the classroom window, the sun climbed higher over the town, casting light on the same streets JD had once known, the same streets where choices like his began. And inside, the lesson lingered, not just about JD Vance or AOC or a single night in Congress, but about the quiet power of standing for what's right, even when the world is watching, even when the cost is high. The echoes of the classroom's stillness seemed to linger as JD stepped out into the fresh morning air, though he was miles away from that small town and its young, hopeful eyes. The city around him was stirring now, shaking off the night's storm of headlines, debates, and decisions. Traffic lights blinked at empty intersections. Delivery trucks rumbled down side streets, and the first wave of commuters hurried toward their routines. JD walked alone, his steps unhurried, the weight of the long night still heavy in his limbs, but lighter in his heart. The marble buildings he passed no longer seemed so imposing, their shadows shorter in the rising sun. The Capitol dome behind him caught the light, its shape both familiar and changed in his mind. Because now it stood not just as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of what that power was meant to serve. In his coat pocket, his fingers closed around something small and solid, a steelworker's pin, simple and worn, the kind handed out at plant gates and union halls. JD turned it over between his fingers, the cool metal grounding him more than the city's stone ever could. He had carried it for years, a quiet promise tucked out of sight, a reminder of the father he'd watched fight so hard to hold on, of the community that had shaped him, of the people who'd never had a voice in rooms like the one he'd stood in hours before. The city's hum grew louder as the sun climbed higher, but JD barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, on what had been done, on what still lay ahead. There would be more fights, more nights like this one. The storm they had held back would return, perhaps stronger, more cunning. But for this moment, for this morning, there was peace. He paused at a corner, looking out across the city's awakening streets, and let the truth of it settle inside him. We don't rescue nations with noise. The words formed as clear as the dawn breaking around him. We rescue them with courage in the darkest hour. And with that, JD turned toward home, the steel worker's pin still in his grasp, ready for whatever came next. This story reminds us that true courage often unfolds quietly, far from applause. JD and AOC's stand shows that integrity can bridge divides when the stakes are highest. It's a reminder that nations are not saved by noise, but by those willing to act when it matters most. What would you do if you had one chance to protect what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.